Why are you here? What attracted you to what, I'm doing?
I have just been curious and seeing your work for some time now, and I've heard many good things about how you have been present to people in grief. As director of Voices of Grief Center, I'm always interested in how do we collaborate with one another in this community, because it takes more than one place or entity to serve so many different people. I saw you was over at the Antlers with some of the Mount Carmel resiliency work, so that was really nice. So I just am curious. What feeds my spirit is knowing what other people are doing. We all have maybe our own way of coming to the same truth, and so the more we find how each other operates, I think it helps us.
Yeah. And we don't talk about grief enough, and we all experience it at some level. I'm so excited to kind of really talk about what Voices of Grief does, because oftentimes people ask me specifically about support groups.
Right.
I don't really plan to do what you're doing.
Yeah.
And so I'm really excited to hear, what does Voices of Grief do? Where are you located? And those kinds of things.
We're located in Garden of the Gods Road, but we really strive to have our grief groups throughout the community geographically, so that we can be available where the need is. So we operate in our groups as we have an 8-week closed group at least 3 or 4 times a year. So by the time we're done, we have at least 12 groups throughout the year, and they last 8 weeks, each of them. So in those 8 weeks, my training has come from Dr. Alan Wolfelt up in Fort Collins. It's a companioning model, and really the way that has evolved is really understanding what a death and grief avoidant culture we live in. So
let's talk about that.
That is a big one.
I was just talking to my director and editor for our grief documentary about this, and we just avoid it. We avoid it as a culture. We're supposed to be happy and positive and move on. And there's some minor acknowledgement, 6 weeks, maybe even a year, depending on the intensity of the grief. But then
there are so many ways I can approach this. I can say personally how I have come to this work is out of my own grief, and we can talk about that. The big driver for me is understanding, some years back, way back, my first encounter with death and grief was losing my sister in a horrible car accident when she was 15. And a young man who was just a careless driver, she and her girlfriend were just riding around before they went to their little job at Pizza Hut, and they went and picked him up and let him drive, and he just was showing off and from a total stop, went careening into a tree and killed both my sister and that young other girl. So there was one of the first times. And then,
how old were you at that time?
I was about 28. So, but I was 14 when that sister was born. So I'm the oldest, she's the youngest, and so it was sort of like,
that's
she felt
your baby
like
sister.
Mine. That's my baby sister.
Absolutely.
And then a couple of years later, my father died of suicide. So, and I have to say, in my case, I did have a lot of support, more than the people I work with. I had a lot of support because I was working on a degree program.
In a mental health degree program. Yeah.
So, but as I moved forward in all of this, part of what I realized, my heart moved more towards dealing with people in grief rather than being a marriage and family therapist, which was my original path. So I actually started working with children, young teenagers, when we lived in Oregon, and I was with the Dougie Center, which was actually founded by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and it's a whole center devoted to working with children who've lost either a parent or a sibling. And it was one of the first times I got very clear some of how their model worked. And then I from there was seeking, really, I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to, because it was actually working with kids that were the age of my sister when she was killed. And so what I saw in that group setting and with the social workers there was they were really doing what I do now, and as I've since learned from the companioning model of Dr. Wolfeld, because part of how they walk with people in that journey, and they did with these young kids, is they just acknowledge what is happening, what they acknowledge, and it's like being that presence, that sometimes I
the
even...
companion model.
Right, the companion
model. Because I can
model.
tell you, so I've lost 3 children, and the first was an adopted son when he was 13 years old in a drowning accident. And the Kubler-Ross theory, I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner. This is kind of, the basis of grief that we are taught. And I was able to go through that process. But honestly, I think that he was an adopted son, and not that I didn't love him, but it is different.
Yeah.
When I lost my biological son, Reggie, in 2016, I literally wanted to say F you to the Kubler-Ross thing. And then, losing my daughter, Maya, intensified that. And so I talk about that a little bit in my grief workbook, but also in the documentary of like finding a grief theory or a process that works for you. Don't say this one is it and I'm not doing it, and so therefore I hate it. I'm not going to process my grief. So then I started doing research and at different grief theories, and I really liked the attachment theory and the continuing bonds theory was the two that really
spoke to you.
Spoke to me. But it could, look into it, research it, continue to try to grow.
And I've also done a documentary on grief, and David Kessler is in my film, and he was a student of Kubler-Ross and actually worked with her and was with her when she wrote her book. And to be honest, part of what he says and what I've since learned is that when she wrote her book, she was talking about the 5 stages of dying. She was not talking about grief, and so a lot of people have transposed that book into, well, these are the stages, and the only misnomer in that, I think, is if people get a little stuck and they, all of a sudden they see 5 ways to do a checklist, and sometimes I think it's meant more to be like in a spiral. If you want to say you've got those 5 stages, you might have anger down here on this first level, and then about a year later you may come back to anger again, but it's a different kind of anger. So I think anything that we can address with compassion and mercy, that's part of my big language, is that I've even learned from another mentor of mine, has been Stephen Levine, and he's written a book called Unattended Sorrow. And part of what I love about him, and it kind of flows with Wolfeld's work, is that part of being mindful of what's happening, because we've been taught by the culture to avoid it. And even though we think we're evolved and we are teachers ourselves, when it comes to our work, I think what happens in my groups is similar to what my process has been. So in the first week, people come in and they say, people are saying the meanest things to me, like, why are you still doing this? And it's been 3 weeks or 6 weeks or a year, and gosh, and can't you just kind of move on and stop the crying? And it's like, so part of understanding this is that, number one, we are all part of the culture. So a lot of times we've taken in those really kind of awful things to say to one another. And then when we start realizing we are using some of that same language as our own self-care, then we realize part of why we might be getting stuck. Are we saying to ourselves, well, it's about time you're moving on from this?
Right.
So compassion for the process is what I actually learned from Stephen Levine. And what I love about him is you know, he has some of this Buddhist thought of loving kindness, but all of his metaphors are Christian. So I like that he can bring the East and West together. So
well, let's talk about that spiritually, right? Because we also live in a culture where you cannot proselytize your belief system on what happens after you die, right? And we have a culture, especially the younger culture, that has no belief system. Not even, you know, saying there is a God, not a God, you know, universal, just even practicing any kind of spiritual health. When I went to school, it was, you know, you were a physical, mental, spiritual person. Like this is your whole being. And I really see a huge spiritual conflict in grief. Right?
I do too.
Even with people who have a strong belief system, right? Like if you have a religious strong belief system, you believe in a God and a heaven, and then that God took your child,
and so you're mad at God for a while.
You're trying to connect to this heaven, which, you know, in religious terms is not connectable, but in Buddhist, you know, philosophy, it's all connected. So I think people get really confused, have a lot of spiritual conflict, whether they had a strong belief system or don't. And I think it's something we need to talk about.
And I really appreciate that you see that and you seek to understand it, because I think part of what we're doing when we're walking with people in grief is we're sharing our own journey as well and honoring their path. And I usually say, you know, find your holy books. Find what gives your life meaning, because this is a deeply, and I'm going to use the word spiritual, path.
It is.
Because it goes to the very core of your being. And as you say, I think part of how our culture has been evolving, you know, we used to be families who lived in the same town, and we were agricultural, and we saw death, and we all went to a little church whether we believed in it or not. We had some pillars that we could lean on, and you know, after the Industrial Revolution, people scattered, families moved, and so we're everywhere. So finding community, finding what gives our life meaning, I think is huge. And I even think when I see some of these horrendous random shootings and some of these just horrendous sins against nature, I think part of it is we have kind of lost our bearings. I think as our culture has been evolving.
Well, and that fear of who's right.
Yeah.
And then you can't, you don't share your journey because someone else might be offended and things like that. And I thought about something that might be a little bit off topic, but in my own journey of losing children, there are times of even thinking about suicide.
Yes, I mean, and that is a normal thought.
Yeah.
You know, it's just we get worried if we start making a plan, but I think it's something that I think is going to come up.
Do you think, and this is a very personal question, do you think that your father's suicide had to do with your sister's death?
I think his suicide had more to do with his own pain. And I don't know that I'll ever understand how to diagnose him. What I do know that is identifiable as I grew up with him was he was charismatic. He was somewhat of a narcissist. To call him a pathological liar sounds kind of cruel, but he was. But I think it was more out of insecurity. Somehow his life wasn't important enough. He had to embellish. I mean, he was a dentist and oral surgeon, and I would go into his office and meet his patients, and they go, "Oh, well, you're the daughter that's going to school in Arizona for her asthma." He and my mom went on this cruise in a windjammer sailboat. Well, he had a painting of that sailboat in his office, and then all of a sudden he owned that sailboat.
Maybe more of like a bipolar 2
maybe
type thing going on.
Yeah, something going on there that somehow
from one extreme to the other.
Yeah, the bottom line is, to me, someone who is doing that is sort of like their life isn't good enough. They aren't good enough. They're going to have to embellish things. So I do think there's a great sadness there. And of course, and it does bring up like what happens when we grieve someone that we've got a complicated relationship with. So, because I felt relief when he died, because he was scary, and when my parents were also going through a divorce, he'd call up and say, I'm on my way over to burn the house down. You know, I mean, he was scary to be around. But I also saw some heart in him, and I saw his humanity. So I think I allowed myself to forgive him for just not knowing how to be the dad he needed to be. He did not get what he needed, so he wasn't able to give it.
In the Mentally Strong method, it really helps to kind of separate those things, because I think when people experience extreme grief, like losing your father, but then having these complicated feelings and emotions behind that, right? Like you have grief for losing your father, but you know the relationship was complicated. We see this, you know, maybe in husbands and wives, or people lose their parent, and there's this complicated relationship.
Unresolved.
Yeah, and kind of separating the grief to, like, you can grieve the loss of that person, but the
other stuff you can kind of put over here
is a different type of counseling. Like when I talk about grief, I talk about the end goal is to cherish the relationship. But when it's complicated, and maybe there is, you know, even trauma. I mean, we've had patients someone who molested them passed away, right? Like, and this was someone that was close to them, and they were supposed to care about that, and very complicated. But being able to separate that grief from, you know, the trauma, the negative self-talk, the things that enmesh with it, and just really make it hard to move forward, you know. But we have to use some sort of terminology.
I know, I mean,
to say, you know, like, we're healing.
We're meant to live a life. It's a beautiful way that you say that to cherish that person on some level, even through the complication. In my terminology, I talk about, you know, we don't get over grief, and that's not really the goal. The goal is to reconcile what happened.
I like the word reconcile. Instead of acceptance. Like, acceptance makes it sound like you're okay with it. And many times, I will never be okay with losing my kids.
Exactly. So it's that reconciliation, and I think the other word that's kind of nice if we're going to draw a picture of it is, as we reconcile, and I really picture reconciling as movement. You know, that is how we move, and we're looking through things, and we're questioning it, and we're talking about it, and then at some point, some other point, there becomes another thing that happened. Wolfelt uses the word transformation, but I love the word the alchemy of grief, because alchemy involves burning and pain.
Yeah, I love that you use the word movement, because I have several videos about, like, self-movement. When we're talking to people and telling them to heal, we use the words like exercise as if it has to be massive movement, right? To make a healthy transition. But mental and emotional and spiritual things move through the body through movement as well. From something as fine-tuned as a tuning fork. You know, there's therapies that use tuning forks and music and sound bowls. In my grief journey, I did a lot of, like, writing things down and putting them in a fire.
Which I think
and burning them. This is all movement. And when we do this kind of culture of suppression or denial, it's really more of denial, like, oh, it's not a problem, I just have to move on, type thing. We're not moving it anywhere. We're
getting stuck, you know, and sometimes being stuck is where you need to be for whatever period of time, but, you know, the hope is that someone or something inspires that unstuck place, and that the movement can then begin to flow. And I mean, that's how we stay alive. That's the living, breathing beings that we are. And I don't know, I think may have been Viktor Frankl, that Man's Search for Meaning.
One of my favorite books.
Yes, mine too. But I think one of his quotes has something to do with, it's just important to go through the fire. And that's where I kind of went to the alchemy of grief, because what alchemy, to me, that is the burning that makes gold. And, the metaphor for me is you go through that burning, and again, it's like the oyster and the pain of making the pearl, but the pain, too, of the burning, and what comes after that is the gold, is the real life. So I think, kind of circling back to what you asked, I think part of the 8-week series of groups that we do, and they're 2 hours a week, every week for 8 weeks. Part of what we walk through, basically understanding how the culture has taught us about grief, and then teaching some alternative ways to look at, well, the culture has said this, and part of that is out of fear. We don't teach people that this is a bad world. We don't teach cynicism. What we teach is this is how we have come to understand this, and for many good reasons we have needed to be rugged North Americans. We've had to be on wagon trains and fighting and doing all this stuff. And now I think if the true evolution is, I want to bring back then, all right, now we don't have to be as on alert to do everything fast and furious, even though we've gotten more in that place, but how can we encourage the empathy for the process? How can we encourage people to honor and understand that grieving, how we grieve, is going to really at some point reflect how we live. If we are going to be staying stuck in our losses, sometimes for some people it's too big to go through, and they will stay stuck, and sometimes it means that they will get sick and they will die from heart attacks or cancer or whatever. Doesn't mean they're bad people. It means that the pain is too much. So we're in that place, and I think I see you there of we are people who have walked in pain, and none of this is over for us either. So, but we're here to offer a safe place to land, to say, hey, this is an honorable journey that you're on, and it's meant to be walked and to move. So when we move in our grief and we feel it and we express it, again, it's like Wolfelt talks about the difference between grief and mourning. Grief, he talks about as being the thoughts of the anger and sadness and, how we think about grief, but mourning is the action, and part of how we move in our grief is to get what's inside out. So that is where the tears come. They're honorable.
And people are sometimes holding on to that. And back to the book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. This is about the concentration camps in World War II. So intense grief, people were losing whole families, right?
Yes.
And
being
trauma,
tortured.
And so a combination of trauma and grief and lots of other things, and he documented that the people that could find the hope within, the most powerful point in that book is when he talked about there was a date that everyone thought they were going to be released, and so the spirits were up, hope was up, people were doing well, they were healthy. That date came and went, and within a year, like 40% of the population had died. Just
because that hope left.
His whole thing in that Logos theory is that you've got to find the hope. That is the ultimate resilience.
Right.
It comes from within. There's not a formula to process your grief.
Right.
But you got to figure out how you can process your grief.
Well, and don't you think, I love that for some feelings of real pain on each of our lives, we've chosen some of this path. And part of it is we have walked in some pain, and we have somehow, whether it's not a real formula either, but somehow we figured out what has given my life meaning and how can I walk this way, and to offer that nugget is the beginning of hope for people, and it's they will find their own way. You know, we're not going to tell them how to do grief. We're going to give them the encouragement to know life is worth living. And how do we carry this legacy on, and how do we find what gives our life meaning? And for some people it will be church, and for some people it's going to be art, and for other people it's going to be music or writing. Paula D'Arcy, who is a wonderful writer, and she's in my film, and she and her husband were on their way to see her parents one day, and she was pregnant, and they had their little 2-year-old, and they were in Connecticut, and a drunk driver out of the blue crashed into him and killed her husband and her 2-year-old, and there she is left pregnant. I remember her words of, you know, some of the words for her first book came out of her journaling, having to journal about this pain and what...
Where can we see your documentary?
Well, right now it's on Vimeo. It's for sale on Vimeo for like $10, but I would say come to my website. It's www.voicesofgriefcenter.org, and ask me about it. And I'll give you also my personal email if people want to find it. I do presentations throughout the city, like I'm going to be in Fountain in another couple of weeks showing the film there. I just showed my film at a church downtown last Sunday. So I use it in presentations, but I'll definitely make sure you see it.
Well, we will download that, and we'll actually have the link in the description for that. It sounds like you interviewed some major people in the grief realm, and so I want
to... Rabbi Harold Kushner, who wrote When Bad Things Happen to Good People. It's an old book, but I discovered that book in my 20s, you know. Yeah, Marianne Williamson, who's one of those kind of out there spiritual people, she's in there, and Paula D'Arcy.
We're going to have the premiere for my documentary May 5th.
Oh, wow.
So I have to make sure
that'll be great.
You get an invite. And
I
can
really
some
want
people.
I want to see it. I'm so glad you're doing a documentary. I think there just aren't enough things out there to be touchstones, because I think we need some touchstones of wisdom along the way because we're all going to have our own different grief language of what is going to help us walk in all of this.
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I just honor that you... It took me 10 years. You probably figured out how to raise money better than I did. Trying to get somebody to cover a film on grief, they just kind of nodded at me like, okay, that isn't fun.
But you were able to really interview some big people, so that's exciting.
It was, I mean, it was hope, you know, and I think all of this is part of my journey, all of this.
Right.
It's not that all of a sudden I'm doing 8-week groups. You know, part of how it started was we moved back here about 22 years ago up to Woodland Park, and there was a hospice up there that needed a bereavement program. So I designed their bereavement program and started doing their groups for them. And that's where I decided to do the film. It's like people coming into those groups, because I don't know if this is some of your experience, but people coming into groups, and the first thing they do is usually tell me their love story, the person that they loved and adored. And about 2 seconds after they say the story and the tears are coming, they're apologizing for crying. And it's like Stephen Levine, when I interviewed him, he said, and I told him this, I said, wow. And he said, can people begin to have mercy on themselves? Why wouldn't you be crying? The love of your life for 20, 50 years, 15 years, however old your child was, why wouldn't you be sobbing at that story? And so that was the beginning for me of like, okay, something is so wrong that we are apologizing for the love story of our life, when that's how we get stuck is, you know, we're not supposed to feel emotion. And it can be terrifying, and especially because of how the culture greets that. Crying indicates vulnerability and strength.
We follow the same people, read the same books. Losing 3 children is... over 17 years is traumatic. People feel so uncomfortable. Like I'm literally living their worst nightmare, especially a mother. People just don't even know how to talk or be supportive. It's always, the culture is negative about it. I think there's a fear of making it worse, not knowing what to say, not knowing how to be that companion. So how does somebody be that companion for someone?
Learn the importance of it first. Understand how it happens that we have learned to feel negative about it. If we understand where that came from, it makes it a lot easier to figure out our next turns. You know, each person decides and understands that will be their answer. Learn first what has been unhelpful in life, and where did we learn that is the truth when we have those voices in our head of the, you know, the critical parent and the nurturing parent, and then we learn how to reprogram those voices. Well, we not only have that from our first family, but we also have that culture also has a voice. And it's a little bit more insidious because it's things we've heard on the news. It's things we think we appreciate about some politician or some big guru out there who says, oh my God, if you feel what you feel, you'll explode. And somehow you took that in. So from then on, it's like, ew, run away from that. There is a gift in having some peace and understanding how to process. You know, to me, we do it in doses. We do not feel our feelings all at once. It would kill you. I am working now with some of the families from that horrendous crime in Penrose, that Return to Nature funeral home.
We actually interviewed someone whose daughter was, that they used that funeral home and they still don't know if her ashes are her ashes.
So look at that, that person's in limbo, and so we just did a vigil last night for about 100 of those families, and bringing them together, that kind of ties back into why do a group for grief. And part of why I think a group for grief works is because you need some kindred spirits around you to feel a shoulder next to yours, even though your grief is as different as your thumbprint. You know, everyone's
and something
grief.
To help get you started. That's why I did my 45 days of grief, because I was like, it's been 9 months since my daughter died, and I'm not feeling anything yet.
Right.
And I was like, this is not healthy. And so doing a grief, even though it's 8 weeks, and you're not going to heal from your grief in 8 weeks, but
it's a beginning.
It's a start. It's like, how do I get started? What about people who don't live in Colorado Springs? Are there national organizations, national support groups, or is there a way to find local support groups?
For people living outside of Colorado, I always encourage folks to go to a local hospice and find out their list of
resources.
Right.
That's great. Right. Great reference. I wouldn't even have thought of that, and it's right in my face
like,
right now, so I don't know why.
There.
But that's a practical thing. Regardless of where you are, there's a hospice organization. They're going to know who the grief specialists are in town.
Well, and there are grief teachers and wonderful people who really do online groups that are very helpful for many people. Oh, and I remember that politician, was it John Edwards, that, you know, he had the big scandal, but part of, this has been, I don't know how many years ago, 15 maybe, but their young son was 16 years old, and he was driving home from the beach, and some freak wind shot across the highway, pulled his car up and upended it and killed him. So it was like, oh my God. And so his wife, Elizabeth Edwards, she wrote a book about her grief, and I loved her book because she gave such great examples of feeling her feelings and allowing it and going to the graveside and weeping. But part of what she did in that time frame, just because she had so much more notoriety, it was harder for her to go to groups, she found online support. So sometimes having a grief group online, I think it's interesting you bring that up. So And the other thing is we collaborate with another group up in Denver who do a lot of things virtually. They do some things in person, Heartlight Center. So if people are living in other parts of the state and hear us today, I do know some, and I can help put this on your site. There's a group with UC Health that for traumatic grief, they do everything virtually, and they're out of Fort Collins in Denver, and they're excellent. And the Heartlight Center does a lot virtually, and the Visiting Nurse Association Hospice has a lot of virtual programs.
I would love to sit down at a different time and do, if you could give us those grief resources. So we have a mentallystrong.com/grief.
Right.
And it's really mostly my stuff.
Right.
But I wanted it to really be a resource for all grief.
And that's what
and
we're
who
doing
else is
too.
doing it, and how do you get, the support from everything. And so I'd love to be able to plug those resources in.
And we just designed a brochure with some of those resources on it. So I'll make sure you get that, because we're listed on there, but we list everyone else too. And there are some religious groups that are doing this called Grief Share, and that isn't for everybody, but for some, it's the only way they would go. So we really acknowledge, here are some Grief Share places to go, and here are other grief groups, because I think part of what we're understanding as we're in community here is collaboration. It's not just one of us that's going to be where people turn, and they're going to be twirling probably out there. And if they're not going to come to me and in 8 weeks have everything be finished. They may need to come over here to you to have more mental health with complicated grief, because we do refer to therapists. Even though all of our facilitators have higher degrees and have some degrees in therapy or chaplaincy, our groups are not meant to be therapy. Our groups are meant to be educational, and a lot of mental health, lovely things happen there because of that authenticity and not having to feel like they're being diagnosed. People are much more able to process. So it's a great processing that happens in those 8 weeks, education and process. So we refer to you for some of the mental health piece of that.
So tell us, just, we'll end with this, like in the 8 weeks, the first time is, you're kind of hearing their story, right?
Yeah.
Do you give them homework? Is there something that they're doing between?
We have a book that we use, Dr. Alan Wolfelt's book called Understanding Your Grief.
Okay.
So it's really meant to be more of like a handbook. It's not like you sit down and read that in the first day. He really gives some very lovely guidelines and some teaching around, this is what you've been told about this, and there is a myth about that. So we go over the myths of grief. We go over the 6 needs of mourning. We go through the cognitive, spiritual, social, all of those aspects of our full human beingness to talk about the importance of self-care. So yes, it is. It has a structure. When we first orient people, I say, so when we have this book, and some people just want to like throw it at me. It's like, because when you're in grief, it's really hard to focus. So, and my next thing out of my mouth is, we have this book, and you may just be holding it for 8 weeks and not being able to read it. For others, it'll be a solace to be able to read something. But we outline all the chapters so that if people can't read it, there'll be some things they have that, we can have a discussion. So we open the discussion so that everyone kind of processes, well, what is this chapter just talking about? And do I agree with it? Or what's my issue with that?
And it's okay not to agree with it. I think this is what happens sometimes in grief is we get somewhere, it either triggers us, or we say, this is not how I feel, and so then we throw out that theory, and really just taking what works for you. Don't stop moving. That's we've talked about that self-movement.
Well, and it's so true, and I think you'll find this interesting, I think even with your documentary in that regard. Like, some people who've seen my documentary 5 years ago, like I had some this last Sunday, and she said, now have you changed the film? And I said, no. what happens is we change over time. So your documentary is going to have a life of its own.
Right.
So it depends on where you are when you see it. So, you know, my film is like over 5 years old, and yet it's still very, you know, pertinent to everything. But I get that all the time. If they've seen it a couple of years ago, well, I know you changed it. So it's like, I did not. It takes a lot to change a documentary.
Yes,
how you are being right here, right now, to me is such a beacon of hope. And you're being so authentic to the pain that is still alive, and that you're still honoring in your precious daughter. And thank you for your words of wisdom, and for being vulnerable to show us some of how this works.
Yeah. Oh, you'll see vulnerable in that documentary. I'm not only crying, I'm also punching a punching bag.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's
are
legit.
getting down on it. I think you and Brene Brown. Thank you.
That was